Bruce is, he's a rock and roll performer, so he doesn't forget his audience in terms of capturing all of those special things that make up the live show. So the core of the river sticks to the E Street Band is a live band, and this Born in USA is very much continuation of it, because there's nothing musically radically different on Born in the USA than there is in the river, but the maturity level is there. He couldn't possibly have written My Hometown in 1979 while he was doing the river, and much less when he was doing Born to Run. But yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a thing of agreeing or disagreeing with Mike Appel, but these are things that are obvious. The guy who wrote Blinded by the Light, writes Valentine's Day or Walk Like a Man within a 15-year period of time, or a little bit less than 15 years. But it's, and that's the thing about Bruce, is that he's always he's reflected his evolution in his music. As he matures, so has his music.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. Joining me tonight is a new friend, a fellow podcaster, a writer, a music critic, and an overall great guy. Mike Derrico is joining me. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to be on the other end of the podcasting thing.
Yeah,
I'm usually the one hosting.
Yeah. So tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I don't like to talk about myself, but I don't want to get too much into real life. But I can give you as far as the things that, let's say, pull me out of real life, and that's things like art and music, and books, and writing books, and I do a lot of freelance writing. Here and there, I host a podcast called Rock Under Fire that recently wrapped up its 5th season. I am currently promoting a new novel called The Locker Notes, which is the follow-up to my Springsteen book that came out last year. Well, actually in 2020. It's funny, now that I actually realize I'm plugging a new novel, but I should have done your podcast last year when I put out the Bruce book.
You sure should have, and so we will talk about that. What was the book?
I should also note really quick. I live about 25 minutes from Bruce.
Okay,
so
good.
I'm pretty close in terms of geography. And it's no, the book was called I guess, well, you said you don't like the words thing. Again, it's short answers, so I tend to ramble.
That's okay. Nothing
wrong
with that.
And I tend to, another thing about if I'm hosting, I usually preface every question with but the book is called Autumn and Everything After. The subtitle is The Murder of John Lennon, The Evolution of Bruce Springsteen, and the Birth of the Reagan Era.
Oh,
and that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
It follows 3 very influential figures through the last months of 1980. So what I did was I pretty much wrote 3 books, but they're simultaneous stories that all take place in a very bracketed period of time. With the election of Ronald Reagan as the backdrop. It's an event that I guess triggers an awakening into a seemingly apolitical Springsteen. And my argument is that these are the most crucial months of Bruce Springsteen's career, because these are events that literally direct and inform his writing pretty much for the next 40 years, give or take an album or 2.
So is this a novel or is it?
No, this
Nope.
is it's no, it's very, very heavily researched,
Okay.
and a lot of interviews conducted over a period of 3 years. It again, I'm talking about three major influential figures who have had books written about each of them ad nauseum. So I had to make
Right.
sure that I told their stories in a way. I mean, nobody was writing this book on Lennon,
Yeah.
and nobody was writing this book on Springsteen, and certainly nobody was writing this book on Reagan. Um, but when with that backdrop, Lennon is murdered just a few weeks into a major comeback. Lennon has Double Fantasy out. He's 40 years old. He's trying to balance and reconcile adulthood, his radical past. Whereas Springsteen is 31. He has The River out. It becomes a commercial success that up to that point that he always wanted. It elevates him from that of a cult figure to a worldwide star. While some might argue that Born in the USA was the album that did that, but I tend to see Born in USA as more of like the exclamation point on that
Sure.
success. You can't go through the Born in the USA period without going through the River period first. And by the River period, I don't just mean the River tour.
Yeah.
The River period begins with No Nukes. Again, at those concerts at the Garden in '79, Springsteen walks on stage a cult figure, and he walks off the stage the biggest rock star in the world. And No Nukes was his coronation. And this was pretty much already established by the time that the River tour begins. And so what I'm offering is the first and possibly only publication that completely examines the River period from top to bottom. If you think about it, at least not to my knowledge, it's not a period that's really widely covered in detail, especially the things that happened on that tour. And there are a lot of things that happened on that tour that changed Bruce so profoundly that it directed and informed the way he wrote the rest of his career.
Mike, what the romantics of a lot of Springsteen fans, especially, long-term fans, is that Darkness tour, that whole, that was, there are many people that would argue that's the epic, that is the greatest it's ever been, that during those time periods. And, as someone who didn't see Bruce live till 2002, I have my own vision of, and I think it's selling his artistic vision short by saying that someone peaked as a live act in like 78, 79. I think he, much like Picasso went through periods or other things, it's different periods. He has different careers. And it's fun for fans to sit there at bars and argue what was the greatest era. But the reality is this is a long journey of his, and each of them are unique and special in their own way. So I definitely am going to pick up the book because I do think that The River was a big turning point. It was the first album I remember buying of Bruce's. And when I first knew who he was because of Hungry Heart, and a friend of my wife's was going to school on the East Coast, and she came back and she started talking about there's this guy named Bruce Springsteen that we're all crazy about. So not really a question, but just kind of, I love the premise of your book. And you would not have drawn a line between Ronald Reagan, John Lennon, and Lennon's death and Springsteen. But once you kind of sketch it out, I could see kind of the outlines of that story.
Well, again, yeah, there are ways. A lot of people asked, well, what could these three, again, three influential figures,
Yeah,
have in common? Well, a lot. But I make those connections at the end. But I mean, one publisher didn't want any part of it because he didn't think I was making enough of a connection. I said, well, these three guys were not sitting in a bar having a beer together.
right.
Lennon met Reagan one time. They were both on total opposite ends of the political cultural divide, you know.
Yeah.
And where Springsteen, again, he was this up and coming young rock star, where Lennon was this aging rock star, again, trying to just balance his past and, reconcile it with him making adult music, the kind of stuff that Bruce would later do on Tunnel of Love. And, it's like you said, there are a lot of people that tend to romanticize the darkness era, and he goes through, any great artist that has the longevity will go through periods of, a few albums of this, few albums of that. Certainly Dylan, Dylan comes to mind, Elvis Costello comes to mind, Neil Young, David Bowie, Prince. I mean, they all comprise periods, like Pablo Picasso. I'm a big fan of his blue period. I like all of the stuff he did before Cubism,
Yeah.
And but anyway, it's I'm not so much arguing that it was his most significant period or it was his peak. What I'm saying is that the events that happened during those months change his writing style. It's kind of his, if you will, his political awakening, because he really wanted nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
He didn't utter a political word. His music's always been political in terms of the content. You don't necessarily have to endorse a politician to see the political implications in Nebraska or Darkness on the Edge of Town or The Promised Land, anything like that. But that said, I do need to give a friendly warning to anybody that's interested in the book, because the book has rubbed a few people the wrong way. And this is the most I'll get into politics, because the book deals heavily with politics. The book does examine in full detail the manner in which both John Lennon and Bruce Springsteen have been historically vilified by the conservative right wing of American politics. There are obvious differences. Springsteen never had an FBI file taken out on him, like John Lennon did. But John Lennon never had Fox News villainizing him every time he opened his mouth, and when it comes to musicians that people despise for speaking their mind, Bruce in the last few decades has been public enemy number one to the right media, which is also ironic because such a significant part of Bruce's audience is conservative. And, you can't, go figure. Yeah, and that's a very important thing. Bruce has always acknowledged that there are reasons, obviously, he's obviously understood the reasons people go one way versus the other in terms of their politics. And he's always honored that. He's never spoken out and said, well, his audience to go vote for this person or that person. And a lot of people tend to think he is doing that, So
because, Mike, as we're recording this, we're about the middle of April, and I always have a backlog of episodes, so this will probably come out end of May, 1st of June, and they're going to go, what were you talking about? But they just had a host on Fox News, or one of the Fox programs, call him a commie. And even though she said, I like his music, but just, he's a commie with his politics. And I think it's interesting, and one of my favorite lines, and I wish I remembered who said it, but last year, 2 years ago, when he did the Super Bowl commercial, someone said the reaction to his commercial about the middle tells you how far away we are from the middle, because he got just as much criticism from the far right as he did from the far left. Just both just really, really given a hard time for a message that, I'm sure he thought in his mind was just, hey, can we find a way to get along? And it's interesting. You wonder, there's a lot of different things that connect us and make us what we are. And so I'm excited about the book, because I can imagine, piecing these together, how do you become this type of songwriter? I know when I read Mike Appel's book, his argument was that after John Landau started taking over Bruce's career, his writing changed. And I certainly am not going to argue with that, or if whether that's true or not, that's up to the audience to determine. But I do think it's an interesting point to say, if you think of, forget Nebraska for a minute, but you just do, The River and Born in the USA and Tunnel of Love, 3 very commercial albums. And in a lot of ways, you could make his 3 most commercial albums.
Absolutely. Bruce is, he's a rock and roll performer, so he doesn't forget his audience in terms of capturing all of those special things that make up the live show. So the core of The River sticks to the E Street Band is a live band, and this Born in the USA is very much a continuation of it, because there's nothing musically radically different on Born in the USA than there is in The River, but the maturity level is there. He couldn't possibly have written My Hometown in 1979 while he was doing The River, and much less when he was doing Born to Run. But yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a thing of agreeing or disagreeing with Mike Appel, but these are things that are obvious. The guy who wrote Blinded by the Light, writes Valentine's Day or Walk Like a Man within a 15-year period of time, or a little bit less than 15 years. But it's and that's the thing about Bruce, is that he's always he's reflected his evolution in his music. As he matures, so has his music. He wasn't writing a lot of love songs in the 70s. He dabbled with it a little bit on The River. Things like as far as like relationship songs and things that happen in Stolen Car and Fade Away and The Price You Pay, and things like Drive All Night to a certain extent. And then he really just plunged into it on Tunnel of Love. His writing has always changed. Going back from I guess if you go back to the free form stream of conscious poetry that kind of showed the Bob Dylan and Allen Ginsberg influence on, and it's all over Greetings from Asbury Park, and then just going into that. And I know you asked the question, maybe we'll address it a little bit later about Mary, about the two kids in Thunder Road, and that whole theme of escape when you're in your late teens and your early 20s. And then it all comes crashing down on darkness. Life hits you upside the head, and you realize, well, maybe we're not going to get out while we're young, and that's, I think, to a large extent, that's what the Darkness on the Edge of Town album deals with. Whereas The River really tries to reconcile it and say, okay, well, it doesn't have to be all dark. Life has paradoxes, as Bruce was saying in 1980. And maybe the light and the dark can coexist together, and hence the double album that The River was. I'm so glad he made that album, because had that 79, that aborted 79 Ties That Bind record come out, I don't know if the story would be the same today.
And Mike, the thought when he did the River tour, right, where they reissued the box set, they did the Ties That Bind album, he toured playing The River in its entirety, and you wonder, he talked about that he thought that if he could write about these adult themes, maybe he could get them. So I do think that was an important part of his journey. And I was asked by a couple of people, one of the things that was unusual about that tour when it was the first leg is, he did The River in its entirety. And one of the things is, the beauty of a Bruce show is the spontaneity that often he will change the set list depending on the tour. And, I enjoyed revisiting that. I ended up going to 4 shows, and especially songs for me, Independence Day became a different song to me, seeing this 60-year-old man singing that a song he wrote when he was a son, talking about his father, and now then in a lot of ways he's singing from the father's perspective, talking about his sons. So I like the idea that he kind of embraced these themes and adult themes in the river and then continued.
Yeah, that's where the one you're talking. Obviously, you're talking about 2016.
Yeah.
I didn't get to see the full river by the time I saw a show on that tour, he was already opening. He was opening with New York City Serenade.
Okay.
I mean, those 4-hour marathons that he ended up doing it at the end.
Yeah.
I didn't actually I did see him do the river once, but it was at the end of 2009 tour.
Right. When you thought he would never do this again, right? Like he had even made a joke about that. Yeah, he said
Clarence was still alive,
right,
and he had done there was this just the very tail end where you had this feeling of anything goes.
Yeah.
And it's been like that every time. Every tour since the reunion has had this feeling of, well, this could be it. It was just like some guy said when he was doing his book signings for the in 2017, said it means more every year. And but yeah, these things are cyclical. It's kind of like your experience of Independence Day in 2016. Is much like that cyclical trip of I mentioned my hometown in its cyclical nature of my hometown, where he's remembering sitting on his father's lap, and now at the end last night, me and Kate, we laid in bed talking about getting out, packing our bags, maybe heading south. He's got, I'm 35, we got a kid of our own now, and now this, the process is just now it's in his hands,
Yeah, I really do. I'm going to get back to some of the questions I normally ask, but I am curious, why did you go from a nonfiction book about music, this trilogy of 2 musicians and a politician? What then led you to wanting to do a fiction book, The Locker Notes? Why did you decide to do that?
The Locker Notes was actually written first.
Okay.
The Locker Notes,
all right.
You know what? I'll say this. The Locker Notes was written many years ago. And we are living in the golden age of independent publishing right now. So I figured by the time I was done writing Autumn, the Bruce book, or Lennon, Reagan book, it's one of each, I said, you know what, I'm just going to put the Locker Notes out. So I spent a year going through it. As soon as I was done, as soon as I turned in the Bruce book, I just spent the next, I guess, 10 months just going through the Locker Notes and tweaking it here and there. And I just to get it out of the way, just to have it lying around, because I am working on another major project that's very much in the same formula as Autumn and Everything After, which I won't be ready until 2024. But I needed to get the Locker Notes. It was like an exorcism. I needed to get it out of my system. I needed to be done with it. I needed to just have it out in the world rather than sitting on it for another decade. So that's pretty much it.
That's interesting. That's
pretty much it.
What's your elevator?
I don't like fiction. I can't do fiction. I hate character development.
What's your elevator pitch for the novel?
My elevator pitch for the novel. It's, if you love the if you grew up in the 70s, I was born in 1970s. That's fine. I'll date myself. I'll be 52 in a few weeks. But if you grew up in the 70s, it's kind of like a time capsule. It's all of the absurdities of childhood suburbia and how you kind of viewed the world, how you viewed adults, the behavior of adults, uh, pop culture, how you saw music, how you saw the TV news, how you saw world events through the eyes of a very small child. If I had to describe it, it's kind of like if you take the Wonder Years and you put it in a blender with A Christmas Story, and you'll get the Locker Notes.
All right.
It's a children's story for adults. It's by no means for children, but it is a children's story for adults. It's told in the adult voice of the kid, very much like the Wonder Years and Christmas Story. There's a whole lot of rock and roll music in it. It would make it, I would say it would be a very, very good soundtrack to it if it were made into a film. And it would make a great one season, 14 episode series. And that's all I'll say about the Locker Notes.
All right, that sounds great. All right, I'm gonna, as we get to the end, I will give you opportunity to tell us where we can get all your fine work.
Sure.
But as I usually say, I always like to start at the beginning, but since we're already 40 minutes into the podcast, I guess, but I do like to go to the origin stories. Talk about, Mike, where did you grow up and what kind of music did your family listen to when you were a kid?
Well, I'm in Central Jersey. I've been in Central Jersey my whole life, in the suburbs, very much like what we read in the Locker Notes. It's loosely based on that. My first music. I mean, I've since I was a baby, since I was in diapers, I've been all about music. Music has been the center, the core of my life since I was a baby. My mother was raised on the vocal group. So I grew up with the vocal groups, all of that stuff, the Duprees, and all that good stuff that you would hear on CBS, which was the oldie station in the tri-state area. And my dad was all about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And so I grew up with a lot of stuff from the 50s and 60s always playing in my house. And then I, discovered at the age of 5. I've never seen anything like it, but it made me want to pick up the guitar and be a rock star again at the age of 5. And I very quickly discovered a lot of the core, I guess, the second generation of rock and roll, like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and those bands. I listened to it all. I mean, scratch the surface. I went through the whole thing. I mean, all through the 80s, I went through a metal phase in the 80s, after which I went back to the 60s and went through the whole counterculture era bands, the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix and the Doors, Bob Dylan, the whole thing. Now I listen to a lot of jazz. I go even further back now. I go back to the roots and, rock and roll, and I'll listen to anything now, anything really. Well, not anything. But
Okay. Yes, I understand. Can you remember when you first discovered Bruce? And if you can, articulate why his music spoke to you.
Bruce was always there. He was always in my house. He was always being played in my house. I guess at the time, it was Born to Run, and then my dad got the Darkness album when it was new. And this is 1978. I'm 8 years old. I'm listening to Kiss, but Darkness was always on. So it was always something I heard. I liked it. I couldn't understand a word he was saying. In fact, when I hear Badlands today, although I know every word inside out and backwards and forwards, I still hear it the way I heard it as an 8-year-old, where I couldn't form any word he was saying. It's funny. And then I remember, the Detroit medley, the Devil medley, being played on the local station WPLJ when No Nukes came out. And I used to see the No Nukes bumper stickers everywhere. I remember my neighbor had the No Nukes bumper sticker, and Springsteen was suddenly huge. And this new album, The River, was coming out. And announced it, I guess, over the summer. I remember the school year started, and I just placed The River as the beginning of the school year. I just associated with that fifth grade year. I mentioned that in the intro of my book. But I really, really got it around the Born in the USA tour. Like, it was when I first saw him. And I mean, it's where I really, really started, with as far as his lyrics and what his lyrics meant to me, and writing college papers about him years later. So yeah, I mean, he's been there my whole life, at least as long as I can remember.
Yeah, that I get that. I understand totally. You mentioned, going to the 2016 tour late in the day, late
Yeah.
in that thing. I always like to preface this, Mike, with the amount of times you've seen Bruce perform live is not a fair barometer of what kind of fan you are. There are people who have never seen Bruce perform live that are diehard fans. There are people that have seen him hundreds of times. That all depends on your age, your economic, where you live. Do you count how many times you've seen him? And if
I
so,
lost count.
Okay.
I stopped counting around the Devil's and Dust period.
Okay.
I'm gonna say it's over 50,
Okay.
less than 100. I'm maybe 60, maybe 70. It's something that I was actually thinking about this the other day, and I said, I haven't counted in a long time, man. But I'm gonna say somewhere between 50 and 70, maybe.
Okay. Very nice.
Yeah.
Are there tours or shows that stand out to you?
Oh, absolutely. The first one, August 20th, 1984.
Okay.
Steven had left the band. Nils was the new guitarist at the time. He was wrapping up 10 Nights at the Meadowlands. Steven came out. They did Drift Away. They did Two Hearts. That was, that's always special. A lot of things after, believe it or not, a lot of things after the reunion tour, like when he pulled out the second to last night of the 15-night stand, he pulled out New York City Serenade for the first time in like 25 years. The beginning of the Rising tour, where he pulled out Jackson Cage for the first time in like 22 years or something like that. You notice a lot of these things have to do with the river with me, but it's and just probably the loudest I've ever screamed at a concert. Possibly the best moment at the Spectrum in 2009, when he I'm pretty sure it was the last night of the Spectrum. He opened with Price You Pay.
Okay.
It's I don't know if set listing has to do with those songs that we're chasing.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the premise of the title of your podcast, because it's one of those things where you're chasing songs for so many years, and there's, the Bruce is not like the Dead, where he played seasonal. So to finally get to see Price You Pay live, and you didn't think you were ever going to see it again, and then he announces very quickly that he's going to be doing The River like 3 weeks later in its entirety. So yeah, those little moments where he pulls out that song that you've been chasing for years.
Yeah, in fact, we will get to that, because that's one of the questions I ask. Are there songs that when he tours again you want to hear live? Listeners, if you're tired of hearing the introduction of the Springsteen of my podcast title, skip ahead about 5 minutes, because Mike and I are going to visit for a minute. So I had a couple things that happened, Mike. One, this guy had done a podcast set in the 80s, 80s reboot Overdrive. And we had done you had to pick your top 4 albums of the 80s. He had a couple of guests on, and I realized I could have picked all 4 Bruce Springsteen albums, right? But I figured that was kind of cheating. So I picked a John Hyatt album. I picked the Brian Wilson's first solo album. I picked, Tunnel of Love, and I can't remember the 4th one. I think Ronstadt's How Like the Wind. So, and then I started realizing this. I did have some people, and we discussed all 4 albums. And Springsteen and I came out, that film, that fan kind of film where the people talked about what Bruce meant to them. And so I went to the guy who ran our podcast network, and I asked Rob, I said, I want to do a Springsteen podcast. There's not a Springsteen podcast. This was back in 2015, 2016. And he says, okay, what's a Springsteen podcast? I said, I'm going to talk to Springsteen fans about their fandom. He said, okay, where are you going to get them? I said, I'm going to get them from social media. He says, okay, great, go for it. If you're passionate about it, go for it. And he loves telling the story. He hung up his phone and he looked at his wife and he said, Jesse's going to do a Springsteen podcast. I think we'll get a season out of it, which to him is 12 episodes, right? Tomorrow, as we're recording this, my 850th episode will be released.
Let me just cut in really quick and just give you an idea of what I'm talking about, how much I can't do my podcast anymore. In 5 seasons, 5 years, we did 76 episodes.
Yeah.
Man, I applaud you. That you are, more power to you, man.
So now
that's amazing. That's amazing.
A little bit of that is cheating, because like I did 40 days. I did for a while there. I was going through Springsteen thoughts of the day. So I would pick a lyric and I would do like a 5-10 minute episode of just that lyric. Right. So that I counted that as an episode because, it doesn't matter. So, not all 850 are a true hour conversation, but that's a lot of me talking.
Time in. It's
right.
Still
yes.
it's
right.
coming out of your heart and soul.
Yeah. So
I certainly include them as episodes.
Yeah.
Your episodes could be 10 minutes or they could be 10 hours. You know, it's all.
Yeah. So when we were talking about, naming it, and you mentioned Jackson Cage, and after the fact someone said, God, you should have named it Jackson Cage, and I said, I sure should have. Where were you when I was coming up with this? That would have been perfect, right?
Yep.
And it's exactly what you said. Because Bruce changes his set list so often, and that people post on social media what he's playing, instead of set listing, you become set lusting. Like, I can't believe I'm not at this show and he's doing this song, right? So that's where the term came from, and it's kind of, 6 years later, it's stuck. So So you named it. You nailed it exactly right, Mike. That's the purpose of the name.
I've been lucky in the sense that, I live in a location where, obviously Bruce lives close by. But a lot of those key moments, a lot of those key shows happens here. Yeah. And I don't take that light. It's like, sure. I realized, a lot of these, when he first pulled out, I was in Philly when he pulled out Icy Bay, but when he pulled out New York City Serenade, man, after it took, I didn't see all 15 of those shows. I don't have,
sure.
But I saw 6. I saw about 6 of those shows, and that I was there that night. He also opened with Night. That show. That was the first time he pulled out Night in 20 years maybe, since like 19. He did it last, I think, he did it once on the Born in the USA tour. but yeah, just a lot of those key moments. I also want to say he did he did two benefits at the very end of the '93 tour with that other band.
Yeah.
When he came back to do he did a benefit for New Jersey Food Bank, or one of those for New Jersey, and he came out with, at the time it was maybe three-quarters of the E Street Band, who, and Max was out, Steve came out, Clarence came out, Roy was already on stage. He came out with Southside Johnny, and the encore, it seems like he played until like a little after 1:00. Concession stands were closed, and a lot of the employees were sitting on the floor all pissed off. They just wanted the concert to stop. That was a really good night too.
Yeah, I love that. I think of that guy from that Springsteen and I film with, his wife is the passionate fan, and he's just, along for the ride. And, she asked, what would you tell Bruce if you could tell him anything? Make it shorter. So,
Yeah.
Which is, too funny. So if I asked the number one album, would you say The River? Is that your go-to? If you and realize I always think it's difficult, because my top three albums change all the time. I love Tunnel of Love. Wrecking Ball is a great album for me. The Rising will always have a special place for me because that was the first show I saw live. Also, my father died on the anniversary of 9/11. It was the 10-year anniversary, and my father passed away. So there is a definite significance to that date for me. So I joke I listen to a Johnny Cash album every 9/11, and I listen to The Rising every 9/11, kind of a way to remember both events. So, but push comes to shove, would The River be it for you?
I tend to separate best from favorites.
Fair enough. I think that's
if I have to pick his best album, I think it's Darkness. I think it's Darkness. The River is a favorite, but again, like I really dissect The River song for song, and there are a lot of, Bruce has been crucified for The River for years, but before, for not the way he arranged it and sequenced it, but for the stuff he left off. The years leading up to the box set, the years leading up to tracks, even, he was crucified for that, and it was just kind of, and I talk about that, but it's a flawed masterpiece. I think it encapsulates. It's a culmination of the first 25 years of rock and roll. Everything that's on it, beginning to end, very much like I think the Clash's London Calling was that type of a record. It just kind of pulls together the first 25 years of rock, and everything that's special about rock and roll is you can hear in the River album. But I wouldn't say it's his best album. I think it's his most. It was the most crucial period of his career, though. It obviously, I think, for a lot of reasons. Again, again, the election that kind of changed the tone of what his writing would be. He starts excavating the American past by going into American history, and he's reading Woody Guthrie's a book on Woody Guthrie, and he's getting into all this Dust Bowl era history. And then he kind of goes back and listens to a lot of the music that came out of that period, and he's reading about American history, and he takes it to Europe with him, and he's talking about this stuff to, his fans in Stockholm. And Paris and London, and he's talking about, well, back home this is happening, and back home this is happening, and then he comes back and he lectures his New Jersey audience about how well behaved and how respectful the European audiences were, and here you guys are throwing firecrackers at me. So it was a crazy period for him. The Vietnam vets benefit happened that summer. Just so many things that change him. He did not come out of that River tour the same person he was going into it. But I wouldn't say it's his best album. It is a favorite of mine, though. My heart's with it.
Well, for example, to me, when I saw the Rising tour, I had only casually listened to the album. And
Okay.
so I've told people that in a lot of ways, I'm I am going to, I felt like I'd walked into a movie halfway through the movie. I knew it was a good movie. I just didn't understand everything that was going on. So when Devils of Dust came out, I listened to that CD over and over and over again. And so when he came to Dallas for the Devils of Dust tour, just him, I loved, because I knew all those songs. I had done my homework when I showed up at the concert. And so I certainly would not argue that Devils and Dust is one of his great albums, but it's an album I have great affection for because of that experience. And I think all of us fans have that emotional attachment to different albums and different songs and different tours because of what's going on in our own lives when it happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I won't get too into detail, but I mean, Working on a Dream is not one of his most treasured albums. It just wasn't.
Yeah.
But there are things that I'm attached to on that record, that are as indelible as indelible as Thunder Road to me.
Yeah, exactly.
The same thing with, there are things about Lucky Town and Human Touch that I love.
Yeah.
They're not his greatest albums, but I'll take Soul Driver over a lot of the stuff that's come out over
Yeah.
the last 10 years,
And, I wanted your thoughts on, I've talked to a couple of people about this. I had a guest and I love this story so much. And so I'll tell it and then I'd love to hear your story. He was talking about that he had been a fan and the reunion tour happened. We had gone through the dark ages where he'd broken up the band, and and he said he was standing in the pit thinking, wow, this is it. This is the height of my Bruce Springsteen fandom. The band has gotten back together. We have gotten live shows. Maybe every few years they'll pull around and they'll do a greatest hits tour, but this is the apex of my Bruce Springsteen fandom. And as he was telling me this, he said, I want to go back to that guy and say, you've not seen nothing yet.
We have no idea what's coming for the next 20 years.
Yeah, you have Magic, you have Rising, you have Broadway, you have an autobiography. You have a album that's being released in the middle of a pandemic, Letter to You. Dude, you have hit halftime. You have not hit the end of the game. And I just love that perspective. Thoughts?
Yeah. Did you ever imagine in 1999 that the reunion tour would be the halfway point?
No. Right? No way.
I remember going into that tour thinking the same thing, this is, because it's one thing I don't really care to talk about my podcast, but one of the things we always talk about was, that rock and roll, was always an experiment. It began as an experiment. It was made by young people for young people, and you weren't supposed to get old. And Mick Jagger said he didn't want to be singing Satisfaction past the age of 40. And now these guys are in their 70s, and there's no precedence for this. There's no precedence for any of it. Maybe the Rolling Stones have become the template for what's possible, but there's no template for it, and there's no precedent. So this is all it's almost like we're just living it in real time. So by the time that the reunion tour happened, Bruce is in his late 40s. We're thinking that's old, man.
Yes.
He's up there, and we had no idea. I don't think anybody did. I don't think Bruce did.
No way. I agree. No way. So are there songs, you said you've been very lucky. Are there songs you're chasing? Are there still do you have a bingo card of, yeah, I'd love to hear this one live?
That's a good question, because I mean, out of everything I've ever wanted to see live, I've seen. I've seen him do The River in its entirety. I've seen him do Wild in its entirety. I mean, at this point, I guess, and this sounds funny, but if I went to see him now and he pulled out, I swear to you, if he pulled out like Gloria's Eyes, I would smile.
Yeah.
You know, with he did With Every Wish. If he did some of those songs that were in his later era that we really didn't appreciate then,
Yeah.
you know, I would love for him to pull out, you know, Surprise, Surprise at
Yeah.
a show that I'm at, you know.
Yeah.
Um, just the things that you know, again, having seen a lot of these songs already, you know, and I'll always say, hey, you want to do Jackson Gates? Great, great. You know,
Yeah.
Lost in the Flood was one of those moments. But again, you know, if he pulled out, you know, I smile when he pulls out something from Lucky Town, you know.
Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, man, they're like old friends too, you know. They're
Sure.
like people, you know. It's like, you know, when he opened Shea Stadium with Souls of the Departed,
Yeah.
that was such a great moment. I was like, yeah, you know, hell yeah. You
Absolutely.
know, it's like, hey, man, it's like seeing an old friend. It's just like, hey, you know, how you doing? You know, Souls of the Departed. Yeah, man, come on board. There's room for you in this 32 song series. You know?
Yeah. Um, what were your thoughts about Western Stars and Letter to You?
Not a big. I'm in the minority on this. I'm not a big fan of Letter to You, but I
Okay.
think Western Stars is a masterpiece, man. It was. I don't get into the award shows, but Bruce was snubbed. Man, that was album of the year, 2019. Man,
Yeah.
Western Stars, a beautiful album. Beautiful album. I loved it.
Yeah, I loved them both, and I understand. I mean, my parents I grew up in a country and western household where Glenn Campbell and, you know, Charlie Pride and Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash and, you know, Hank Williams were played all the time. So I really appreciated that. Not that anyone cares, but I'm like, it is a shame that because of today's atmosphere, because there was a time that Bruce's cover of Rhinestone Cowboy would have been a hit on country radio, right? Like the country stations would be playing that, but it's just not the way radio works nowadays. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I love the album. I love the film. I am jealous of everyone in the barn. I would love to have been there.
Yeah.
You know, it is just great. And I hope we get a couple of those songs on when they tour again, that at least a couple from Western Stars. You know, I think he's going to do a fair amount of Letter to You, along with
Yeah.
what, you know, some of the other songs. But yeah, absolutely.
I like that
Um,
he took out some of those old, you know, those old chestnuts, like
yeah,
Song for Orphans,
yeah,
If I Were the Priest. And
yeah,
I mean, Danny Needs a Shooter, man. That is a devastating version. That is just like it's
yeah.
like you hear Darkness Ever Brutes,
Yes,
you know.
absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
what have I not asked you that I should have, Mike?
Uh, I don't know. It's your podcast.
Well,
You know,
and to you know, pull the curtains back a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, I I was interviewing a guy multiple years ago, and the interview went fine. We had a good
Mhm.
time. And then after I hit recording and I shut down everything, we're talking, and he says, "Oh, next time I'm on, I'll tell you about when I got drunk with the E Street Band." I'm like, what? How do
Hmm.
you not lead with that story? So just in case, Mike, if there is a, brush with fame where you talk to some of the E Street bands and you got drunk with them. I want to give you a chance to tell that story.
I've never gotten drunk with anybody in the E Street band. I met Danny. That's about as far as my adventures with Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band go. I can't say I've met Bruce. Haven't.
Yeah.
The closest I've been to Bruce in proximity was let me see if I'm missing anything though. Okay. There was a night when you know what, I can't say I met Bruce. There was a night I was in pretty close proximity to him, but I didn't know he was there, but he was just getting into his truck. And it was a night where I was at a place in Asbury Park called the Rock Horse.
Okay.
And funny thing is, it was right across the street from the Stone Pony.
Okay.
To get it, Rock Horse, Stone Pony.
Sure. Oh yeah, I like it. I love it.
Southside Johnny was playing there, and Bruce. The whole thing was, anytime Southside played the Pony, the bigger story was whether or not Bruce was going to show up.
Right.
Well, he showed up, but I did not get in. But anyway, no, I didn't. I have never met anybody. I've never got drunk with any of the E Street band. It must be an interesting story though, for anybody who has.
Yeah.
No, I don't have any really good stories to tell about that.
What are you working on now besides the new book? Is there anything else you're working on creatively?
The new book has taken up most of my creative time.
Okay.
So I'm going down the rabbit holes this summer with interviews.
Okay.
And I can really talk about whatever, what the content is. So this is early at this point. I jinx myself.
Yeah, no, I understand. Are you go ahead and give us I know you said you didn't want to talk about your podcast, but just give me a little bit about what's the name of it. And
I'll talk about my podcast. It's just, it's been so long since, we're between seasons normally.
Yeah.
But I think, I made the announcement at the end that it may be the end. I think that the podcast has gone as far as it will go. Mm-hmm. I think if I put in the time and energy, it's going to be towards something else. But it's called Rock Under Fire. It kind of looks at rock's place in the 21st century, what its role is in the 21st century. Once upon a time, rock was the cultural zeitgeist. It informed fashion trends. It kind of reflected the world, politics, and just everything. It is no longer the center of the cultural zeitgeist now. Right. And we kind of looked at that. We often play devil's advocate in this long time thing that says that rock is dead. Though I don't necessarily believe rock is dead, I very often play devil's advocate, and we kind of turned that on its head and kind of took that apart, and very often challenged it, and very often we almost proved it, mm-hmm. depending on what we were talking about. But it's we occasionally had guests. There was really no consistency to the podcast. Each season, again, ran for about maybe 8 months of the year, maybe 6 to 8 months of the year. We did maybe about a dozen episodes per season. We had a lot of good people on, but it was, again, we had my friend from the fourth season who since passed away, Joe Long, a great guy. He was a bass player in one of the 65 to 75 incarnation of the fourth seasons. By the way, I'm doing a new Springsteen. I'm doing a Four Seasons podcast. If there are any Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons fans out there, I've been taking part in a 4 episodes so far, a podcast of it's called Seasons on Saturday. You can find that on YouTube.
Nice.
Any fans that I just remembered that. It's not something that I'm in charge of, so it's kind of nice where I just get to log on,
just show up and talk. Yes.
It's called Seasons on Saturday. You can find that on YouTube, and it's done with Lee Shapiro, who is the keyboard player in Frankie Valli's arranger during the 1970s.
Oh, interesting.
So we do that with him and the guys who run the Four Seasons fan club in the UK.
Oh, very
A guy
nice.
named Ken Charmer. But yeah, Rock Under Fire, it's still out there.
Okay.
You can find it on, it was originally on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, but we're on Stitcher, it's Spotify, we're on YouTube, and that's pretty much it. I doubt we're going to come back with anything this season, but and we had, there were some good interviews in there. We had Nina Blackwood and from MTV, and KK Downey from Judas Priest was on, and Joey Mullen from Badfinger. So we had some interesting guests. It's always fun to have somebody that's gonna put some downloads on my RSS feed.
Yes, absolutely. I do know that feeling. I do this out of love, but it is nice every once in a while to like, oh, good, people like this thing. That's good. Yeah. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way to do it, Mike?
Well, I'm on social media. You find me on Twitter.
Okay.
Mike /Derrico, Derrico. I have a website, Derrico Untitled. Derrico Untitled is one word, .com. I'm out there. You put my name in a Google search, you'll find my work will come up.
Good. So, all right. And the books are available in
you can find both books. They're you can just Google either The Locker Notes or Autumn and Everything After. Mike Derrico. You'll find them on Amazon. It's available on Amazon. It's available through Barnes and Noble online, not in the stores, but online. Okay. And a lot of various different indie sellers online. If for anybody who prefers not to use Amazon, because I know a lot of people don't.
Yeah. So, that's good. Very nice. Well, this has been a joy. I have loved visiting with you. You are a great guest, and it was fun. I hope that people who are fans of yours have come over, have enjoyed the conversation, and I hope they check back some of my earlier episodes. But if you are a fan of Mike, either his books or his podcast or his work with local papers, I end every episode with the Mary question. What the Mary question is Jay Armstrong, who is a retired honors English teacher. He has a new book out as well called Bedtime Stories for the Living. When he was teaching, he would take 2 days out of the curriculum and break apart Thunder Road. They would look at the lyrics. They would talk about the themes. They would compare this to Robert Frost and other American poets. And he would ask his class at the end of the 2 days, does Mary get in the car? Mike Derrico, does she get in the car? Mary gets in the car. She gets in the car. Thunder Road pretty much, Thunder Road is everything symbolic about the whole mythology of the modern American landscape. But it's like all of the best elements that are captured in the best rock songs. There's that struggle for a place to belong, the sense of purpose, but yet they're still young enough to still long for that freedom, and that love and freedom and hope and faith are like the key words of Bruce's entire body of work, but it's always a continuous story, and we check back in on that relationship 5 years later on the river. That's where Mary reappears, and these little intervals of time and space in between, and Mary's place sums it all up on the rising. It's old friends and everything in between. Well said, my friend. Someone else brought up the fact that on Racing in the Street, she sits on the porch of her daddy's house. He says that's the same porch that she dances across. And I was like, I'd never connected that before. And now she's got the eyes of one who hates for just being born. Yes, exactly. And that's what I said, in terms of darkness,
life hitting you in the face.
Absolutely.
And you got to learn to live with what you can't rise above.
Well said, my friend. Well said. Mike, this was amazing. Thank you so much for
Jesse,
your time.
It was fun. Thank you for
doing this.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about my work a little bit. And it's always fun to talk about Bruce. So
Sounds great. Listeners, you please be safe. Check with your doctors, get vaccinated, get boosted, and let's be kind to each other, because that's how we're going to get through this. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, listeners. And we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.
That's a wrap.
Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts as well as a Merry Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now, who does? You can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference. You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.